So Jeannie's resume, or her history. Jeannie Lenore Langford was born in Narrows, Virginia, and has lived in Hopewell since the age of 3. She graduated from Hopewell High School and attended the College of William and Mary, where she focused her studies on history. Ms. Langford is employed by the Appomattox Regional Library System, which serves the city of Hopewell and the counties of Prince George and Dinwiddie. She is the assistant librarian and archivist for the Ann K. and Preston H. Leake Local History and Genealogy Room, located in the headquarters building of the Appomattox Regional Library System. Ms. Langford is certified in museum management, having graduated on March 11, 2013 from the Virginia Museum Association's program, and she is currently pursuing an advanced certification. So without further ado, Jeannie. Susan.
Well, we won't be making dresses today. However, we might be making something else. And all recipes are welcome, as long as said still is well hidden. So without further ado, yes. Sorry, just drop it. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to some of the moonshiners and bootleggers from Hopewell, Prince George, and Dinwiddie. Some of the law enforcement that tried to get rid of said stills, and we'll even talk about a rat-think horse. So let me begin. Of course, Prohibition came along, which there are many aspects to it, but basically it tried to dry up liquor consumption and beer consumption and wine consumption. But what people don't understand about alcohol is, yes, it has its bad points, but throughout history, going back at least 7,000 years to some artifacts they found in China, alcohol has been produced. And what's the reason for that? Well, unlike what you see on the Western movies, you don't exactly want to go up to that river and get a big handful of water and drink it, because it's dirty. So many of these societies consumed alcohol because they could not consume the water. It was dirty from animals drinking in it, from human waste. So the alcohol kind of cleaned that up for them. In colonial society, it was impolite to serve water or milk to your guest, because milk goes bad very quickly and the water might not be too hot either. So they made alcohol. Well, with Prohibition, of course, people still like to drink. And in some societies, like I said, they really didn't drink water. So it kind of started an illegal industry. And one of the first bootleggers here was King Cotton. Now, King Cotton came here during the DuPont days. He ran a club called the Blue Moon. Well, Prohibition comes along, and that hurts his business because there's no alcohol. Well, he starts making deals with the people out in the county who can manufacture said alcohol, and the Blue Moon continues to operate. DuPont got so upset about the Blue Moon that they bought a fleet of powerboats in the early 1900s to patrol the river to try to chase down these bootleggers and the bootleg runners. Well, try as they might, it's still getting through. So King Cotton and the Blue Moon are making big money. Well, finally, what was the Hopewell Police Department decided it's time to run King Cotton out of town. So they ran King Cotton off to Florida, and they thought this was a good thing. This would get rid of their problem. Well, King Cotton got drafted into the Army for World War I. And just where do you think they stationed King Cotton? At Fort Lee. So King Cotton was back in town. And much to the chagrin of all the law enforcement, King Cotton was still bootlegging and driving around in a very fancy car. So King Cotton stayed till the end of the war. They never sent King Cotton overseas from Camp Lee, which is now Fort Bragg Adams. So King Cotton made a lot of money here in town. Then he returned to Florida, and Prohibition is still continuing, and he makes a lot of money running from Florida to Virginia, and Virginia to Florida back. So that's the legend of King Cotton that continued to plague the local police. Down here on the end, we have Fred Peg Miller. Now, Fred Peg Miller came here during the DuPont days, and he had a job at the plant. He had one leg. Needless to say, the name Peg. So he worked, but of course with Prohibition, Peg found the opportunity to open a beer garden, which was in the 20s right next to the gate of 2B's on 3rd Street. So of course the men get off of shift work and go over to Peg's beer garden. Well, Peg didn't really run the best of places. Peg's place was prone to some violence. So the police were always trying supposedly to catch Peg, but Peg had a few extra dollars, so he was able to pay off the police a little bit. Well, a group of young men from the University of Richmond drove down to Hopewell to visit Peg's beer garden. Well, these young boys got to cutting up, and Peg shot and killed one of them. So, Peg had to be tried here in Hopewell. So, they tried Peg for not murder, but manslaughter. Well, they only gave Peg 2 years for manslaughter and sent him to jail because the judge thought that a murder charge was a bit harsh. So Peg served his time, and then he got out, and he went right back to running his beer garden. Well, then there was what they called, back in those days, the Siege of Hopewell, because they were getting tired of Peg. So they surrounded Peg's house, and it was during the winter. It was freezing cold. So Peg is nice and warm in his little house, in his little beer garden, And people are still coming and going, and the police are sitting around surrounding Peg's place. And they sat out in the cold for 8 days trying to catch Peg bringing in whiskey or beer. Well, Peg didn't bring anything in. So finally the siege was broken. So they left Peg alone for a while. But Peg wasn't quite as tight with the judge as he thought he was, so he got arrested and was sent to prison again. Well, lo and behold, for some reason, known only to the governor at the time, the governor paroled Peg and said, now Peg, here are the 2 reasons, 2 things you can't do. You can't go back to Hopewell, and you can't be involved in bootlegging and moonshining anymore. So what do y'all think the first thing Peg does? Peg comes back to Hopewell. Nobody really cared, but Peg's wife is still here. So apparently Peg had a bone to pick with his wife, and so he shot and killed his wife. So needless to say, as soon as they could, because Peg was hiding out and his buddies from the beer garden were hiding him, they arrested Peg for murder. Well, this time, Peg decided he wasn't going back into jail. So about after 6 days, Peg killed himself. Nobody would claim Peg's body and his family, but the friends from the beer garden did get Peg buried. About 1.5 years ago, a young man from North Carolina called me, and he was researching his family. And so he mentioned Fred Miller. And I said, uh-oh. So as it turns out, and I told him all about the peg leg and all that, so as it turns out, Fred's wife was this person's great aunt that had been killed, and they did take her back to Carolina and bury her, but nobody in the family ever talked about what happened to her. So I had to tell him about Peg and what happened. But he was quite interested, and I think it appeased his curiosity. My next friend over here is Hopewell's remarkable bootlegger barber. Now, Mr. McWilliams came to Hopewell during the DuPont days. He was a talented barber, and he ran a little legitimate barber business. But when Prohibition, like so many others, come along, he figured, I can make a little money. More money than cutting hair. So, Mr. McWilliams starts opening more or less what you would call speakeasies. And eventually he becomes known as the Al Capone of Hopewell. He was basically, even though we all know about Eliot Ness, but this guy truly was the untouchable because he knew everyone. He had everyone in his back pocket, from the police to the judges to even the newspaper editor. The newspaper editor gets locked up because he won't rat on Mr. McWilliams. So Mr. McWilliams gets locked up over in the old jail, and he's not in a cell. He's not in jail clothes. He has a rocking chair, and he sits in the jail and holds court. Basically, what Mr. McWilliams says goes. Well, finally we get a little bit more law and order here in Hopewell, and Mr. McWilliams leaves. And he goes up to Maryland with his children to a beach community to live and to prosper. Well, a little bit later on, the entire family gets busted because they're running numbers in the 50s up at the beach club. So whole family gets put in jail. But they only gave him, he was a lucky man, they only gave him a very, very light sentence. And when he got out, he did return again to Hopewell, and he did start cutting hair again in the 50s and 60s, but he pretty much stayed out of trouble. So that's Mr. McWilliams, the bootlegging barber. And over here, we have the legend. Mr. Harvey Flunky Cousins. Many of you would have known about Flunky. I remember hearing about him from my daddy. Flunky came here as a young man, and he worked at the plants. But Flunky ran a nip joint. And you have to think, Hopewell was a shift working town. So for a graveyard worker, 1 o'clock in the morning is his 5 o'clock somewhere. Well, actually 4 to 12. Graveyard worker, 8 o'clock in the morning is his 5 o'clock somewhere. Well, they had all the laws about, well, you couldn't serve after this, and by this point the ABC laws had come into effect. But Flunky pretty much ignored those. So his place operated. Mr. Flunky was busted 31 times. He was defended by someone that many of you might remember, Hardaway Marks. And for the most part, Flunky would get 10 days in jail. Everything would be over, and then things at Flunky's would go back to normal. And you might think, well, that's a bad thing. Flunky running this place down in Davisville. But what we have to consider are the times. Flunky made money, but Flunky was very willing to care for the people in the African American community. If someone needed shoes for their child to go to school, they could see Mr. Flunky and pay him back. In those days, a lot of African Americans could not go into a white bank and get money for a car or a new stove or whatever they needed to get, but they could borrow it here from Mr. Flunky. I'm sure he charged some interest, but he provided a service to the community. Mr. Flunky was the one who bailed the Reverend Curtis Harris out of jail when he was arrested for trespassing at City Hall and the sit-ins at George's drugstore. So he also got to meet Dr. Martin Luther King. I will tell a quick story about Flunky's place. I never went in there. I know a few folks who did. But during the 50s, Hopewell had only one police car that had a radio. So, a certain, I will not name names, a certain patrolman had the car with the radio. He was on patrol, and the new shift was coming on, and so the chief of police told one of the young officers, "We'll just walk on down to Flunky's and pick up the patrol car, because that's where he is." So they were, the bootleggers, a big part of our history. Now, of course, on the other side was the lawman, constantly trying to bust steals or close down the places that were selling alcohol. One of the places was quite clever. Downstairs was a pool room. Upstairs was apartments. And they had a soda fountain machine. Well, the pipes to the soda fountain machine ran up to the second floor, and they tapped into jugs and kegs. So what do y'all really think was coming out the soda fountain? But in many cases, they were busted. Does anyone remember Sheriff John Atwood out in Prince George? Now, Sheriff Atwood used to come up to the Moose Lodge when I was working there, and Sheriff Atwood was unique. But he was kind of hard on the bootleggers in Prince George and Dinwiddie, even though Dinwiddie wasn't his jurisdiction. So he would be out patrolling, and then they'd find a steal. And his choice of destruction was dynamite. So there was a still down near the border of Prince George and Surrey. So Sheriff Atwood surveyed the whole place and looked around and studied up on how to get down there, maybe without getting shot. So they go down there and they round up the family, which it was the whole family. Sons, father, mama was even in on it, because she was doing the shopping for the sugar at the grocery store. So he goes down there and rounds them up, and then he gets out his dynamite. Well, this is a very large still. So Sheriff Atwood got a little carried away. So he put all the dynamite he had on the still. I don't know how much, but he blew up the still. Well, the still ended up in Prince George, and parts of it in Surrey. So the case had to be tried in both jurisdictions because the evidence was in two jurisdictions. And we'll step down here for just a moment. This is Nellie. Nellie belonged to a bootlegger and moonshiner up in the mountains. Now Nellie was the best worker ever, because the bootlegger had trained Nellie. He could put his shine in Nellie's saddlebags and send Nellie down the mountain trails, and she'd just sashay along and stop and make her deliveries. And then the money would go back in the saddlebags, and Nellie would go home. So one day, Nellie is sashaying down the road, mountain path, and she strolls past a revenuer. Nellie stops, because Nellie wants to do a little business. So the revenuer didn't think too much about it, but then all of a sudden he started hearing clinking sounds come out the saddlebag. So he pats Nellie down. And yes, Nellie is loaded with moonshine. So they arrest Nellie. They take Nellie in. So Nellie's busted. And they decide, well, maybe we could rename her and then we'll use her as a rat thief. So they changed her name to the Bootlegger. Well, Nellie never ratted out her original owner, but she worked for the revenuers for a considerable amount of years because Nellie knew all the paths up in the mountains. So she would lead them to everywhere except where she came from. She never ratted out her owner. That's Nellie, the Treasury Mare. This photograph was taken in the late 50s. And this was one of the largest alcohol busts in the state of Virginia. And if you'll notice, the gentleman that was arrested, they don't know his name, but he has his hands like this. Well, that's kind of a code to let the other moonshiners and runners know that he's not going to talk. But what's interesting about this, and I was told this, and I've kept my word about not telling about the family down in Prince George name. But one of the biggest stills was down near Brandon, run by a family who even got phone calls from the state police that a sugar truck had overturned on Route 10 and to send the boys down to get the sugar. But anyway, this family, they did make a considerable amount of liquor. And one of the biggest distribution points, and I'm not going to mention the name of the business, we'll just say that an extremely large furniture store in Petersburg, named after a tree, in the rear had another business going on. It could be delivered and distributed from there. So they were bootlegging and moonshining everywhere, even after Prohibition was gone. And believe it or not, it still goes on down in some places. Franklin was the capital of moonshine making and bootlegging. There's still a few places and a few people who dabble in making their own concoctions. I'm innocent this time. Yes, Daddy did blow up the garage with the beer that he made that time. But I haven't been doing that lately. But they were breaking the law. Some of it did involve some very bad things. When you get money involved and you're in a criminal operation. However, some of it is very amusing. And when you look around at the person sitting near you, every now and then somebody knows somebody from back then who was doing something. Because it could make money, and alcohol did have some curative properties. It could be legally ordered medicinally, but for the most part, it was just to help people feel a little bit better. So I'm not condoning bootlegging and moonshining. I'm just telling you the stories, and I have enjoyed being with y'all today. And next time, I think I'm going to try to prepare extra program just so that I can be ready if somebody's out or ill. Because this was 2 days' notice and I had to go back and relearn all this stuff. But thank you all for being here. The 3rd of July program, we are looking very much forward to hosting it at the library. I've been around and tested some things out. There will be ample seating on the first floor, and the upstairs mezzanine holds some wonderful views. We'll make sure there's up there seating, and Brian and I will kind of serve as the official door people and tour guides to get y'all where y'all need to go. So thank you so much, y'all. I have enjoyed myself.